We have a lot of conversations about fertility. We have a lot of conversations about diabetes, about obesity, about heart disease. But I feel like the missing piece that we're not talking about is these exposures and how relevant they are to those diseases and our increasing epidemic levels of problems that we're having. And so I hope that now that there's more awareness about them, I hope that starts to weave into the conversation, the mainstream conversations that we have, and that these mitigation strategies start to take hold.
This is Fat Science, a podcast dedicated to the science of why we get fat. No diets, no agendas, just science that makes you feel better. This podcast is for informational purposes only and is not intended to replace professional medical advice.
I'm Dr. Emily Cooper. I've been treating patients with metabolic issues for over 25 years. I'm on a mission to raise awareness about metabolic dysfunction and why diets don't work.
Hi, I'm Andrea Taylor. I've been fat, very fat, chubby, morbidly obese, and done almost every diet ever invented. They all worked until they didn't. I've known Dr. Cooper forever, but when I became her patient and we learned metabolism was the real problem, wow, everything changed, and I've never been healthier.
And I'm Mark Wright. It's time for Fat Science.
Wait, does this podcast make me look fat?
Welcome to Fat Science. I'm Mark Wright, along with Andrea Taylor and Dr. Emily Cooper. It's great to see you two.
Great to be here.
On the show today, endocrine disruptors. I think a lot of you listening probably have heard this term before. These are things that can mess with our metabolism, and often we don't even know it. So on this show, we've talked a lot about how complex the metabolic loop is in our bodies. It's essentially a series of many, many hormones and receptors and brain chemistry that all regulate the use of energy and the storage of energy in our bodies. So it is a really big deal when that system is disrupted by something. So Dr. Cooper, let's start by exactly defining what is an endocrine disruptor.
Well, when we're talking about endocrine disruptors, we're really talking about chemicals that we're exposed to in the environment. And these are specific chemicals that are found to interact with our hormonal system. And so sometimes, because they can affect our weight and be what's called obesogenic, meaning they can promote obesity, they're sometimes called also metabolic disruptors. But in general, it's just a vast group of chemicals in the environment that are very persistent in our environment. So they're also nicknamed forever chemicals because once they're there, it's really difficult to get rid of them. But we've known about them for a really long time. Nearly maybe 90 years ago was when the scientists started understanding that some of the common chemicals that we were already being exposed to were affecting our hormonal system. So unfortunately, there's been this knowledge, and some of these chemicals first came on the scene in the mid 1800s, and they're still with us today because they are forever chemicals. So It's a serious thing because not only do they affect our lives currently, but they also affect our offspring and their offspring, even if they're never exposed to the chemicals themselves. Just because of our own exposures, it's affecting generations to come. So it's really a concern. They interact with hormones that help prevent heart attacks, strokes, diabetes, obesity. They interact with hormones that are responsible for our reproduction. So it's just such a vast problem.
Is it that some of these chemicals mimic our own hormones, or they somehow block our hormones from doing their job?
It's both. So some of them do mimic our own hormones, and some of them do block our own hormone function. So one of the biggest issues is that some of them that mimic our hormones, we really don't know what a safe level of exposure would be, because what we found is at very high levels, they're very detrimental. But as we go lower and lower and lower in terms of our exposure, the smaller the exposure is, the more our body reads it as part of our body. And so it may actually take the instruction from that chemical to alter our hormone system in even a more extreme way if the exposure is at a very low level. So that's why a lot of times scientists are saying there is no safe level of exposure. So once we find that out, we really don't know what we're supposed to do then, because we're basically all exposed.
Okay. When I first found out that we're basically doomed, that my I knew that my plastic containers were kind of bad, but then I found out how bad, and I'm like, okay, my plastic containers are making me fat. All right, those go in the garbage. And then I'm like, my rug, okay, we're going to get a new rug. And then, all right, cans are making my can big. And then you got the parking receipts from the parking lot.
Mhm.
All right, that's bad. And then you got the CVS receipts that are gigantic that you can make a scarf out of. Those, don't touch those. And then makeup, hair dye, whatever. Like everything everything's terrible. So, what's the worst? What can we do? Because basically we're doomed and everything is horrible. But we got to there's a level that we can deal with. We can't do everything. We know that there's stuff everywhere. What can we do?
Well, it's true. Like the main sources really are things that you've pretty much listed, a lot of it, but it's flame retardants. And flame
Oh, yeah, I
retardants.
forgot about them. The pajamas.
Yeah.
The pajamas for the babies. Oh, my God.
Boy. Yep. So, and flame retardants are also in our electronic devices, a lot of them.
They are?
TVs and
Oh, so your phone doesn't go on fire. Oh, my God. I didn't even think of that.
and they emit from there into our air. And so these chemicals are in the air we breathe, the water we drink, the clothes we wear, the food we consume. And so, but the main categories really are the flame retardants, pesticides, and then a lot of the things that come from plastic, which would be things like PFAS, you've probably heard of. It's like what's involved in anything where it's trying to waterproof or moisture proof something. So it could be even on your jackets. It's in pizza boxes, popcorn bags. It's just creating this kind of barrier. And then
is this? Yeah. I've got a little protein drink here, the little box, that I buy.
Yep.
Do you think that this has a plastic coating on the inside?
I'm not exactly sure with those kind of paper cardboard ones. I know that they do have some kind of coating, but it's maybe not as much as like cans that are lined with BPA, and BPA creates a barrier so that the liquid in the can won't corrode the metal material. So it's a little layer of plastic that's in there. And then phthalates, which are the crinkly water bottle type plastics. So those are kind of there's others in that category, but those are where we get most of our exposures from plastic. So it would be like butter wrappers and then even things like fragrance have little tiny plastic beads in there to help disperse the scent. So if you see the word fragrance, that also, is affected. Ooh. Children's toys, a lot of children's toys are affected, and even medical IV bags. If you go and get an IV, the bag itself leaches into the fluid in there. Wow. And there are some bags that don't have those endocrine disruptors, but hospitals normally don't use those very often because
too expensive.
They're not that much more expensive, but they just don't use them. Some hospitals have taken a step to transition over, but so medical waste is a big source of a lot of these forever chemicals as well in our environment.
Dr. Cooper, before we move on, I'd love to just sort of provide some solutions. So from a consumer standpoint, if we're concerned about PFAS, BPA, and phthalates, what can we do from a consumer standpoint to minimize our exposure?
Well, I think just think about what you're doing as a consumer and look at when you're choosing items, can you make choices that keep you from overly utilizing plastic packaging in your food supply? That's a good one. And in your household products and your personal care products, avoiding things that have that word fragrance. So going for more unscented or essential oil kind of add-ons. And then if, say, you're bringing a child into the world, thinking about where maybe it's not a good time to remodel the house and remodel the room you're going to put them in, because then you're going to,
Because the carpeting can off-gas
yes,
this
the
stuff?
off-gassing of the carpeting and paint and adhesives and things like that. So just kind of planning things a little better. I think one of the best things to do too is if you're a young couple and you're going to be conceiving, to think ahead of time. And what they have found is both women and men preconception, at the time of conception, that are transmitting, their genetic material, it's affected by the chemical levels in their body. And so taking time to reduce those levels, it takes about 4 months of avoidance of some of these like real culprits. And by reducing those for like 4 months, the levels that you're transmitting on to the developing offspring would be much lower. And then for women who are pregnant, reducing your levels are actually really important to reduce your levels of especially the phthalates, because what they have found is if those levels are high during pregnancy and you have a male child, it actually affects your child's future fertility and their sperm count. And so if you were exposed and
Wow.
if they're exposed in utero to this stuff. So as much as we like to just make light of it and say, well, you can take these steps and it'll reduce your risks. Yes, that's true, but it is a very big problem. So we have to come up with like a big solution for this big problem. In your personal life, yes, I would probably try to avoid being on the high end of the spectrum of exposure. And as Andrea said, you're never going to eliminate your exposure.
You can't.
No,
You
no.
can't.
So again, just avoiding things that are obviously full of like ingredients you don't recognize in food supply, food packaging, that's that crinkly plastic, bottles, cans.
Like using glass instead of cans,
Exactly.
or fresh fruits and veggies instead of canned or
exactly.
bagged. Yeah.
And, there's a lot of controversy over pesticides and organic food and non-organic. But again, pesticides really do leave residue. As much as we try to say they're safe, there are endocrine disrupting elements in those, but then we start getting into this discussion. It's not very equitable because you start to try to improve your environment and it's expensive to do so sometimes. The choices that you have to make to keep free of some of these disruptors might be more costly in some ways. But in some cases, they may not be. Like, for example, say you need a new car. Well, maybe get a used car. And because then that's already off-gassed.
So somebody else took the off-gassing
Somebody else
for
did
you.
that. Right, exactly. But yeah, and then when you get a new mattress, it's recommended to like put it in the garage for like 6 months before you bring it in.
Yeah, unwrapped, I'm guessing. Out of the plastic,
so
right?
that it can, yep. And so,
Yeah.
Of course, there are things you can do, but then there's some things that are just going to be quite difficult. Our water supply is one of the concerning things right now because we're now being told that a big high percentage of the water, the public water system in the US and well water, is contaminated with way above the legal limit of PFAS, for example, PFAS. So that is a big concern. And so right now there are some mitigation strategies underway to try to figure out a plan for how do we remove this, that's so widespread throughout our country. How do we remove it from the water supply? So we're living in a time where there's starting to become maybe a little more hope, actually. Apparently, for the last 25 years, the EPA has done almost nothing to protect us, which is like shocking to me because I always thought the EPA is there, it's going to protect us. But apparently, no, it really hasn't. Everything's been at a standstill there, where there's tens of thousands of chemicals that really are not clear if they're endocrine disruptors or they're not. And if they are, they're supposed to go through this whole process that's just not been happening. But actually, just last month, a bill was passed. And it now has made it so that we have legal limits throughout the country for the PFAS that are much lower than what anyone imagined they would be. And so some states had taken the lead on limiting the PFAS, like Washington State, I did early on, set their own limits because there were no federal limits. But now that the federal limits came out, they're set much lower than even what we had in Washington State. And the scientists say that they set that limit, it's 4 parts per million. They set that because they feel that's the lowest feasible amount that we can get it to by the mitigation strategies to remove it. But scientists say that's still above the safe limit. So these are just things that I think we should be aware of. As much as it's not sugarcoating it, we have to be aware that there is a situation here where our health is being impacted by this chemical environment. And we're talking a lot about obesity. And in the conversation, we're not talking about the environment when it may be the leading cause of obesity.
Yeah, it would be odd if this obesity diabetes epidemic was just happening for some other reason, right?
It has to be a contributing factor.
Yeah, it just seems like it. Dr. Cooper, a lot of our refrigerators have pretty sophisticated filters on them. Do those filters have an impact on this stuff?
Great question. They do. They do help. So the water filters in the fridge definitely help. Reverse osmosis systems help. Filtering your water does help for sure. And then, as Andrea was bringing up those plastic bottles, now we know that there's like thousands of little microparticles of plastic in each of those bottles that we're ingesting. So getting away from that and using the filters is a lot better than, just buying more bottled water. That kind of doesn't make sense.
Andrea, did you switch to like a metal water container for you, or?
Well, I actually have a filter in the fridge that I just put the water right into my container. I have a glass bottle that
gotcha.
I put because once I found that out, I was like, oh, no more bottled water for me.
Yeah.
I'm like, wait, just one more thing I don't need. And last week, all over the morning news shows and then of course the late night comics was a whole research study on fertility. There was a guy had done a study on fertility, and when he was cutting apart testicles, which I'm sure is very painful for you to hear, Mark, but they found heavy concentration of microplastics in all the testicles.
Yes.
And he was really surprised. Like he wasn't looking for that, but so it cut the sperm counts. He did it on humans and dogs and across the board. It was like, and he was kind of shocked at how much.
Yeah.
And being a non-scientist as I am, I was like, how'd the microplastics get in the sperms? I'm like, whoa. But yeah, it's everywhere.
It's everywhere.
Do you think it's because it's in the oceans and then fish eat that and we eat the fish?
And the water.
Yeah. And it's also, we're flushing stuff down through our sewer system. And so we're getting a lot of it from there too. But yeah, it's the same kind of model. What you were talking about, Andrea, is the reproductive health. Scientists a while back, not pretty recently actually, had this groundbreaking publication where they tried to figure out why sperm counts are going down so fast. And they ruled out everything. And then it came down to the endocrine disrupting chemicals.
That's what he said in this study. He's like, it's water, air. It's unavoidable. What his thing was, it was unavoidable.
Right.
Endocrine disruptors.
Right. And in these studies, they linked it to the phthalates primarily. And they were able to actually assess all kinds of data that really showed that significant. And the concerning thing is that I think it was between 1973 and 2020, the sperm counts decreased like 50%. And then after 2020, it's decreasing at twice as fast of a rate. So
they said this study was shocking how much microplastic was in there.
Yeah, and it's not just the microplastic in our body. As I said, it's more the exposures in utero and the exposures preconception, because as we're developing, our reproductive system is actually developing when we're a fetus. And so the exposures there affect our future outcomes as well. So it can be also the
Right.
microplastics are throughout our body. They're finding it in all kinds of things like blood clots and coronary artery plaque. It's basically everywhere.
Yeah.
But I think the effect on reproductive health is tremendous, and it's not just the male; it's also the female reproductive health that's affected. So here we have a lot of conversations about fertility. We have a lot of conversations about diabetes, about obesity, about heart disease. But I feel like the missing piece that we're not talking about is these exposures and how relevant they are to those diseases and our increasing epidemic levels of problems that we're having. And so I hope that now that there's more awareness about them, I hope that starts to weave into the conversation, the mainstream conversations that we have, and that these mitigation strategies start to take hold. There's something called the Superfund, the US Superfund, I think it's called, where they've put billions of dollars towards these cleanup efforts. And so we should be seeing this is now a turn of events and a different way of looking at it than we have before. There's a little bit more efforts now to really try to make a difference on a national level.
You got to have an idea that you could make everybody prejudice against plastic packaging the same way we all now hate styrofoam packaging. Like you just,
Yeah, and
there's
like
got to be,
aerosol cans and stuff
right,
like that.
like there's got to be
Yeah.
something that says, okay, let's come up with something better, or let's come up with something better than those flimsy receipts that are not good for you. Like it has to be
Yeah.
not that hard to refigure a machine to print something better.
Yeah, and I think it starts also at the university level. There's a lot of young people that are going into different fields and chemical engineering and things like that.
Right.
And I think they're saying now,
They need jobs.
and they're saying now that the priorities, at least that our country is starting to voice, are that any future chemical, instead of like doing this isolated approach, like replace this particular one with something else, that we want to look at whatever we're developing, number one, that it does not have any endocrine disruption properties, that it does not interact with our hormonal system. Number two, that it's not a forever chemical, that it breaks down, it biodegrades, and does not leave a trace. Those two things are kind of what the biggest focus now is on any kind of new chemicals that we're bringing onto the scene. So hopefully that comes with some kind of regulations that make that happen. But I think as consumers, we just have to be like, look out for our own personal environment. And I mean, Mark, you're in the right business. You have an organic farm. we probably all should try to grow our own food or something. I don't know.
But even so, Dr. Cooper, I go to Costco and we sometimes get dinners from Costco and they come in plastic packaging and they recommend heating it in the plastic bag. And I'm just thinking, oh my goodness. So I always take it out of the plastic bag, but I guess I shouldn't even be buying the plastic.
That's a step.
But speaking of plastics, we always look at the bottom of the plastic container to look for the number to, in terms of whether to recycle. But can we be informed by that number, Dr. Cooper, in terms of the safety of plastic?
Well, yeah. I mean, it's thought that 2, 4, and 5, if it says 2, 4, or 5, those are thought to be the safest because that type of plastic doesn't interact with the food as much. So you're not as likely to pick up elements of that in the food. But that doesn't mean that you won't get like microplastics in there that are just like sharp, tiny little fragments. And that supposedly comes from both the manufacturing equipment and the containers. But so that, while those are better because it's not going to be leaching into the food, then you still have some plastic exposure there. But that's something that people could do is start trying to limit that. And you'll see when you start looking at the bottom, you'll see a lot of ones and you'll see other numbers that are not as good.
But it's funny because like you go to Erewhon here Erewhon is a fancy organic crazy supermarket here. And so they have all these organic foods, and half of them are in plastic containers. And I mean, they have all the foods that they make come in lovely jars, but a lot of the other stuff comes in a plastic thing. And you're like,
That's interesting. Dr. Cooper, one thing that I think has been coming up over and over on this podcast is that what we do as human beings can have an impact on the next generation and the generation after that. I think that's such a foreign concept to most of us. We're such complex creatures that understanding the genetics and just what we're passing on to our offspring is such an unknown to the average person. And I think a lot of people would be dismissive of an idea that if I use a lot of plastics and ingest them, that it's going to somehow impact my offspring. But help us get into that mindset of understanding. And where are we from a scientific standpoint in understanding all that stuff?
Yeah, it's very interesting. I mean, they started looking at this with DDT exposure, and they found that if your great grandmother was exposed to DDT, then you still are having the negative impact of that DDT. And so even though you may never have been exposed, but when it comes to things like these endocrine disruptors, it's very interesting because again, it goes back to the developmental state of the fetus. That is where our gonads are developing, the male organs and the female follicles, and all of that is already developing as a fetus. And so what they found in studies is exposing that fetus to, for example, the phthalates, which have been studied a lot, it literally stops the development of especially the male reproductive system. And so then the offspring is not going to have healthy eggs and healthy sperm to pass on to the future generation. And then that also affects the genes that they're passing on and will affect the future generation's development. So it's very interesting how that happens. And they've been able to track the phthalates 3 generations, and they think it may go on a 4th generation. Like they don't know how far it goes into the future, those detrimental impacts. But another thing that happens is exposure to BPA and phthalates can affect part of the metabolic pathway in the brain that is responsible for producing some very critical hormones that keep our weight normalized and our blood sugar and our insulin normalized. And so that's at the pituitary gland level. And they show that exposure to those chemicals literally halts the development of that area. It prevents the total development of that piece of our metabolic pathway. So a person is born and they just didn't develop that part of their metabolic pathway. So it's going to be weak. So they'll be more prone to obesity, diabetes. So it's really interesting how we don't think about these things. We're just so kind of short-sighted and looking at our own lives and not how it's impacting these future generations.
well, and not only will they be more prone to it, but then when they have
Yes.
children, the children's children,
Yes.
it just gets worse and worse and worse.
Yeah. And there's other ways that we pass things on because, say, that offspring developed diabetes or prediabetes, and then in pregnancy had gestational diabetes because of it. Then the offspring of someone who had gestational diabetes now has a much greater risk of diabetes and obesity. And then their offspring. So it is, yeah,
Right.
it's hard to tell what was the original, quote, genetic problem versus the environment and how it impacted our genes.
I feel like before we wrap up, Dr. Cooper, we should talk about makeup because I remember when I first started seeing you, I was working in TV and we had to spray on this makeup with an air gun and literally coat our faces every day with
Yes.
this makeup. And you were just cringing.
Yes.
How do we find makeups that aren't endocrine disruptors? I mean, are there companies making specific makeups now like that?
Yes, there's more and more all the time. And a good resource, and you're right, cosmetics is one of the biggest sources of these endocrine disrupting chemicals. So that is definitely an area, to work on. But a good website would be the Environmental Working Group, EWG.org. And they have an app. I believe it's still called Healthy Living app. And I don't use anything in there about like dietary advice or anything, because I think they got a little bit too far in that area. But they do have something where you can scan barcodes of personal care products that you have at home, and
wow.
also household cleaning supplies, because those are also unfortunately loaded with endocrine disrupting chemicals.
Yeah.
And so you can scan the barcodes and it can give you like green, orange, red zone information about it. And so it's a good idea to have that app out when you're at the store and you're buying stuff. Just scan it. A lot of people that use that app and go in their bathroom or their kitchen and start scanning things, it's like,
It's frightening. It's frightening.
yeah, it's like, uh-oh. There's a lot of
it, I think, is because of fragrance.
Yes.
Like the household products, a lot of it is fragrance.
fragrance. Yes. And yeah, and there's a lot of things, like a lot of people like to putter outside. And so they've got like the rust preventers and the solvents and the things like that. And it turns out that not just the solvents are bad, but they put things in there that are considered inert ingredients, like stabilizers. Those are also endocrine disrupting potentially. And same thing with pesticides. There's the pesticide component, but then there are inert ingredients added to it. And the inert ingredients also have potential to be endocrine disrupting. So there's just a lot. And so if you can get back to like clean with vinegar, make your own little soap and vinegar mixture. Why get the commercial stuff if you don't need to, for some of your cleaning at least? And when you're outside, considering if you're spraying things, like really investigate what you're using and make sure you have proper protection, and think about that's going to get in your soil. Do you have animals? Do you have children around? So I think just being a lot more thoughtful and less trusting, because understanding that although we do have Environmental Protection Agency, they really haven't been, they've been kind of asleep at the wheel until maybe fairly recently. So, we can't trust what's out there. And so you kind of just need to do what you absolutely have to as in terms of chemical exposures, but everything else, try to find alternatives. And there are a lot of alternatives, I think, that we could put into place.
And if you look historically, I mean, this stuff didn't exist before the industrial age. So in the last 100 years, the human body had never been exposed to these molecules and chemicals and compounds that have been created.
Right.
It reminds me of that movie where I want to give you advice. And what's that? Plastics.
Oh.
And oh my gosh, yeah, it makes sense, Dr. Cooper, doesn't it? That the with the dawn of the industrial age, all of these thousands and thousands of compounds are brand new.
Yes.
Are brand new to the human body.
They are, and they're affecting us.
Yeah. Andrea, do you stand by the statement that you started with, that we're all doomed?
Yeah. But you know what? As I also always say, you have to live your life, and you got to get out. You got to have fun. You got to do stuff. And you can't, maybe you're going to have a few more weeds in your garden.
Yes.
You can't do it all. You can't do it all. So you have to live. You have to do things, but you do the best you can.
Yeah. And a few weeds in the lawn are not going to kill you. Dr. Cooper, I feel like this is such a great thing to talk about, because when consumers start to create movements, that's when we see real change in our society, when companies realize that it behooves them. Like, I've got compostable bags that I use now for my compost bucket in the kitchen. Like back in the old days, those didn't exist.
Yep.
So now I can just chuck those into the compost bin and not feel bad that I'm, putting plastics in the environment. As we wrap things up, Dr. Cooper, any final thoughts you want to leave us with?
Well, I was kind of inspired to hear about that new Superfund project and the new bill that passed last month. I kind of do think that if people are interested, maybe just inquiring at their local level and state level about what's going on in your area to help with this cleanup strategy, like what chemicals is the state targeting, and are they tapping into that Superfund, just so that you have more awareness of what's happening, and sign up for some newsletters to find out, what is happening in your area, and maybe even volunteer if you have time. But I think it's such an important area. And I think the scientists are actually calling on the public to get involved more, because they're saying that the public needs to get more involved in order for things to happen and for change to occur.
Well, it's been super interesting talking about endocrine disruptors and what we need to know and just to raise that awareness. So thank you so much, Dr. Cooper. Thanks, Andrea, for another edition of Fat Science.
No diets, no agendas, just science that makes you feel better.
I'm Mark Wright. Thanks for listening to Fat Science with Dr. Emily Cooper, a Work P2P production. New episodes drop every Monday. If you've enjoyed the conversation, subscribe, rate, and review this podcast. This production is for informational purposes only and is not intended to replace professional medical advice. Join us next week for another episode dedicated to the science of why we get fat. No diets, no agendas, just science that makes you feel better.